This week, I sat down with author Paul D. White to dig into one of sport's biggest injustices, the historical exclusion of African American players from the Baseball Hall of Fame. We break down the barriers that kept Negro League legends out, from segregation to arbitrary rules like the 10-year major league requirement. We'll also learn about the steps the Hall has taken to include more black players and the work that there's still left to do. If you care about baseball's full history, this is an episode you won't want to miss. Let's get into it.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Rounders, a history of baseball in America. I am your host, Jeff Lambert. Today, we're going to be talking about the fight to desegregate the National Baseball Hall of Fame and include minorities such as African Americans. And to discuss the subject with me, I have someone who literally wrote the book on the topic, Paul D. White, who's the author of Cooperstown's Back Door, a history of Negro Leaguers in Baseball's Hall of Fame. Paul, thanks for joining us for today's episode.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it.
So before we jump into the topic, I would love to be able to get to know from you, where did your interest in this topic first start? What's the background to you wanting to do research into this?
Sure. Well, I'm from Kansas City, so the history of the Negro Leagues is deep here. This is where the Negro National League was founded. It's where the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is. I have a degree in history, so it's always been an area of mine that I focused on, and I've written a bunch of things related to baseball history. But the fact that Kansas City is sort of the founding place where the Negro Leagues actually began, where Rube Foster was founded it in the old Paseo YMCA down near the 18th and Vine district in Kansas City here, was sort of the impetus for it. Plus, I went to a Royals game with my son many years ago. He was probably 12 years old. And Buck O'Neill was there. A bunch of Negro Leaguers were there because it was Negro Leagues Appreciation Day. And my son insisted on standing in the heat and getting a Buck O'Neill autograph. And Buck O'Neill could not have been the nicer person in the world. He was very engaged with my son, and asked him to promise him to hit a home run the next time he played a game. So he was wonderful, and that kind of triggered it for me to start digging into the Negro Leagues a little bit more.
Now, before we jump into the exclusion of black players from the National Baseball Hall of Fame, I think it would be a good idea to just set some ground information as to what were some of the factors that led to the segregation of the sport for the first 60 plus years of its history for the American and National League.
Sure. Well, the sport was segregated flat out of racism back in the 1880s. There were black players who played professional baseball. But through the efforts of folks like Cap Anson, who is in the Hall of Fame now, he basically, and others like him, refused to put their players on the field if black players were on the opposing team. So caving into that pressure, a quote unquote gentleman's agreement was formed to not have black players in the major leagues anymore. And that's the way it stayed until Jackie Robinson. But the Hall of Fame was founded in the 30s in the midst of all of that. And that was during the Depression, and the area around Cooperstown was particularly hit hard by the Depression because it was a resort area and not many people were going on vacations during the Depression and whatnot. And so as they were trying to come up with something that would help the economy of the town, and they struck onto the notion of baseball because of the myth of Abner Doubleday, who was from there, supposedly inventing the sport. They decided they were going to have a baseball museum of some sort. And then Ford Frick, the president of the National League at the time, decided to say, hey, why don't you go ahead and make it a Hall of Fame, which was great. But then they needed the cooperation of baseball to do that, to get the players interested, to get artifacts, things like that. And since baseball was segregated and the Hall of Fame needed their assistance, they decided to not allow black players in either. They basically ignored the fact that black baseball had a rich history just as long as white baseball at that point.
And we see Jackie Robinson, like you mentioned, he's the first African-American inducted into the Hall of Fame. That was in 1962.
Right.
Then we see a gap where no other players are inducted. What was going on behind the scenes after Jackie Robinson? Were there people pushing for more black players to be included, other movements going on to try and build on that momentum?
Yeah, there were. There, at kind of hand in hand with the push for integration was a push for the Hall of Fame to also integrate. So you saw that a lot in the black media, the Pittsburgh Courier, which had Wendell Smith writing for it, and the Chicago Defender, and Sam Lacey was another black writer who was writing about it. And they were advocating for the integration of baseball, but also saying, hey, these are These are Hall of Fame worthy players already playing, the Josh Gibsons and Buck Leonards of the world, Satchel Paige and so forth. So they've just continued that push once integration actually happened. And then others started slowly joining that. Some white writers started joining that. There was a guy named Dave Condon who wrote for a column for the Chicago Tribune. He was particularly vocal about making that point. And Bob Feller, of all people, spoke up on behalf of Satchel Paige, who was his teammate at one point, despite the fact that he had not been great in his relations with the black players that he'd been teammates with Larry Doby, with Satchel Paige. There had been a lot of tension there. He, at one point, said he didn't think Jackie Robinson would make it in baseball. He didn't believe that he had the skill set to do it. He was a controversial guy on this particular subject, but he stood up for Satchel Paige's inclusion in the Hall of Fame right around the time that he was elected, which ironically was 1962, the same year as Jackie Robinson.
Right.
So there was a little bit of that, but the real push came when Ted Williams, in his induction in 1966, literally on the steps of the Hall of Fame, said that he felt there was a place for the Josh Gibsons and Satchel Paiges of the world. And the Hall of Fame really couldn't ignore it at that point, since he literally said it with all of their leadership behind him. At that point, the wheels started turning a little bit more. You started getting folks like Dick Young, a very influential writer, columnist for the New York Daily News, threw his weight behind that in his columns. And then Bowie Kuhn, who was the new commissioner in the late 60s, had been a fan of the Homestead Grays growing up in Washington, D.C., where the Grays played half of their games. He'd been a scoreboard operator and had watched those games at Griffith Stadium, and he got behind it as well. And they all kind of then pulled together to push the Hall of Fame leadership, which included Ford Frick at that point. He had stopped being president of the National League and then commissioner of baseball. And by this point, he was chairman of the board of the Hall. And was still opposed to having Negro Leaguers in, but that conglomeration of folks kind of finally pushed him to do the right thing.
So who were some of the Negro League players that benefited from this push after Jackie Robinson was inducted, who were able to finally get their names in the Hall?
Yeah, it was when they first decided to do it, they were going to do it in not the greatest way, in very much a separate but equal way. They said, we'll put in basically an all-star team. We'll put in one person per position. They kind of fudged it ultimately by putting Martin DeHigo in as a second baseman when he really wasn't. But that's essentially what they did. They were going to put them all in as one big display, not as actual Hall of Famers with their own individual plaques in the plaque room. They were going to have a separate place to honor them. And when that became clear, and after this special committee was formed and picked Satchel Paige as the first one, and it became clear that that was how he was going to go in, he very famously said, I'd love to go in the Hall of Fame, but I'm not going in the back door. And lots of media members and whatnot basically said the same thing, that you're essentially segregating the Hall of Fame. Sure, you're letting them in, but it's separate but equal. You're not putting them in as equals of the same of the white players who'd been in before. Right. They changed that, thankfully, and did put those players in as individuals, so that you finally got that first wave of Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson and Buck Leonard and Cool Papa Bell and those guys. But they were essentially an all-star team, one per position. The bad part about that is that, for instance, because one pitcher was already in, Satchel Paige, they couldn't put in Bullet Rogan, for instance, because another ridiculously good Negro pitcher was not able to be put in the Hall of Fame, because the way they decided to do it was, no, we were only having one per position. They could have put Bullet Rogan as an outfielder, but they already kind of had that slotted for the Monty Irvins and Cool Papa Bells of the world. So he wound up not getting in that first wave. He might have been the best Negro Leagues player ever. Certainly in terms of like a Shohei Ohtani, he could do both. He could pitch and hit ridiculously well, but he had to be skipped because of how they decided to structure that first wave of inductees.
And there seems to be more waves that occurred after this, initial push at the end of the 60s. So there was another crop of players that were inducted in the 1970s. We saw another small batch in the 1990s. Was there anything behind those movements as well, or was it just momentum from that first expansion?
No, there was the Hall of Fame's been very clear that they are an organization that will follow public opinion. They are there to the way I wrote it in the book was that they want to reflect public opinion as opposed to making the public reflect. They're not doing anything that's going to be outside of the mainstream. So putting that first wave of players in the early 70s came on the heels of the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
That next big, they only put in two more players, or one player and one pioneer, Rube Foster, throughout the entire rest of from like 77 to 95. They only put in two more. But what happened in the early 90s was the baseball documentary that Ken Burns did, which got an enormous amount of publicity, particularly for the Negro Leagues, because Buck O'Neil was such a great spokesperson for the Negro Leagues in that series. And that got an additional upgrade of attention to the Negro Leagues, which caused them to say, okay, we'll augment the Veterans Committee elections each year by making them have one extra spot available solely for Negro Leaguers. So there was a string of 7 years in a row from like 96 to 02 or something like that, where they put in one extra Negro Leaguer. And then in 06 is when they decided, okay, let's finish this off finally. The Buck O'Neills of the world are not going to stop advocating for this. And they said they would create their own special committee, populate it with researchers and scholars, people who are experts on the Negro Leagues, a couple of players as well, and say, let's put in as many as you can. That's when they got their big election of 17 members of the Negro League. Most of those were players, but some of them were owners as well. And since then, they haven't elected a player since. They've put in Bud Fowler, who was pre-Negro Leagues, and they put in Buck O'Neil, both of those in 2022, but both of them went in as pioneers. No player or umpire or manager has been elected to the Hall of Fame from the Negro League since that big 06 class.
Who would be on the top of your list of players that have not been inducted yet that should be in the Hall of Fame?
Well, they keep nominating John Donaldson, and they should, because he was a ridiculously good pitcher. He was the guy who kind of bridged that time from before the Negro Leagues into the Negro Leagues. He was very a big attraction during barnstorming. He sort of helped create barnstorming and innovated as the business model for how these black teams could not only play a lot of games, but make a lot of money. Before the organization of the Negro National League in 1920, they didn't have a league to rest, on and have a schedule and draw fans and whatnot. They had to go out and find those fans and play in front of whoever they could play in front of. And so this barnstorming model, and John Donaldson was one of the main people responsible for that, was incredibly important. On top of which he threw 14 no-hitters and had 5,000 strikeouts and things like that, none of which can really be verified, unfortunately, because this is pre-league days and a lot of the numbers are against town teams and not well documented and things like that. But he is such a big presence in the formation of the Negro Leagues themselves, but also in that history of black baseball prior to the Negro Leagues that he should be in. And I would argue for Vic Harris, because he was not just a very good player for the Homestead Grays, but he was their manager for most of their great years, and easily is qualified as a manager by the Hall of Fame standards for managers, which is, anybody who's ever won 4 pennants as a manager is in the Hall of Fame, with one exception, and that's Vic Harris. Vic Harris is, he won 7 pennants. He has a better winning percentage than Dave Roberts, who is the all-time Major League record holder. And yet he's not in the Hall of Fame. And that's because no black manager from the Negro Leagues is in the Hall of Fame. There are people who managed in the Negro Leagues who are in the Hall of Fame, but not for managing. Oscar Charleston, for instance, is in as a great center fielder, which he was. He also managed, but he's not in for his managing. And Rube Foster is in as the executive who founded the league. Also a great manager, but he's not in for his managing. So those would be, they were both on the Veterans Committee, or ERA's committee ballot, I guess it is now. This year, they were both passed over, unfortunately. They won't even be eligible for another 3 years because of the way that these ERA's committees rotate which groups are looked at. So they're two glaring omissions. I did write a piece about it on my Substack account. There's probably 15 or so black players or managers who are easily qualified. And if they would ever do another exercise to kind of true up that time period, it would be worthy, and they would find plenty of folks who are certainly qualified.
And in addition to the Players Hall, has the Baseball Hall of Fame done enough to honor the Negro Leagues itself and its legacy?
They're doing better. The existing leadership of the Hall of Fame has taken a few steps in that. There's another kind of societal catalyst that helped push them along, and that was the unrest in the 2020 time period around the George Floyd murder and so forth, and the push for social justice reforms and whatnot kind of was, again, something that pushed the Hall of Fame, I think, because the timing is a little coincidental for them to then say, okay, let's revisit how we present the Negro Leagues in our facility and how we cooperate with others who are honoring the Negro Leagues, like the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum here in Kansas City. And they do a little bit more kind of cross-pollinating of artifacts, and they'll share things. Bob Kendrick, who is the leader of the museum here in town, is on their Black Baseball Initiative board. And so they try to coordinate that better. And they've reopened that. I've not been to it since they reopened it, but they reopened their Black Baseball display in the Hall of Fame. It's no longer just confined to the couple little rooms that they had. It's still there, but they've also kind of sprinkled throughout the entire hall additional references to what was happening in Black baseball during those periods of history. If you've been to the Hall of Fame, it's sort of a chronology. When you go up to the second floor, which is like the main history of baseball part of the museum, it's a bit of a chronology. And so they've been better at sprinkling throughout that what was happening in Black baseball. In the prior iteration, you had to make a conscious choice to go find out. Every other part of baseball was sort of this timeline flow through the hall. Even when they wanted to honor women's baseball, it was part of that. When they wanted to honor Latin baseball, that was part of that. But Black baseball was literally in two separate rooms that were not part of the traffic pattern. You had to walk past it, but you didn't have to walk into it. So you had to make the conscious choice to do that. That has changed a bit. Those rooms are still there, but they've weaved more into the hall, to my understanding, and based on the literature that they put out about it. So that's much better. I would like to see Major League Baseball do a little bit more in cooperation with the Hall of Fame as well. The fact that they played a game at Rickwood Field in Birmingham last year was a very good step in that direction. They, of course, have finally recognized the Negro Leagues as major leagues and recognized their stats as part of the Major League Record Book. That's great. I would like to see more cooperation between them. And I'd like to see the Hall of Fame do a little bit better, like I said, in terms of going back and looking at the time period the Negro Leagues existed from, pre-1950, essentially, and doing a better job of leveling out the percentage of representation. They've put in a fair number of Negro Leaguers, which is good, but they're still not in the proportion that they played. There was roughly 1/3 of all major leaguers. Now that these are major leagues, now that they're considered to be major leagues, roughly 1/3 of all major leaguers during those time periods from like 1920 to 1948 were in the Negro Leagues, but they are not 1/3 of the players in the Hall of Fame who played during that time period. They're a little bit less than that. They're more like 1 in 4. It would be nice if they went back and kind of trued that up and cleaned out that backlog of players so that they didn't have to keep waiting and hoping every 3 years that they get onto the final ballot and then hope that they push through. It's very hard, as Dave Parker can tell you. It took him forever, and he was the only person on the Veterans Committee ballot this year who got in. He was sharing that ballot with Vic Harris and John Donaldson, and he was the only one who got in. So, they put in only 1 or so per year from the Veterans/Eras Committee. They're never going to get rid of that backlog if they continue it that way. So that's a big change that I would like to see them make.
Well, the book, folks, is Cooperstown's Back Door: A History of Negro Leaguers in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Paul, where can people pick up a copy of this to learn more about this incredibly interesting topic?
It is for sale on all the usual online booksellers in terms of Amazon and Books A Million and Barnes & Noble and all of those folks. You can get it from McFarland Publishing. They're the ones who put it out. There's an ebook version of it available on Amazon as well. And also, you can always find my other writing on my Substack, which is pauldwhite.substack.com or lostinleftfield.com. They both go to the same site. I publish something on baseball history every weekday. So,
yeah, you can certainly, Paul. I'm always impressed by the volume that you put out in terms of what you write for Substack. So I would encourage everybody to subscribe and follow. You put out some great content every week. I enjoy reading.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it.
So I'll make sure to include all these links in the show notes. So if you'd like to get a copy of the book, if you'd like to follow Paul either on Lost in Left Field or on Substack, that'll be there for you as well. Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
My pleasure, Jeff. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.